Okay, so what if democracies didn't die with a bang? No big military coup, no violent revolution. What if instead they just sort of faded away, like a
Hmm.
whimper almost? We often think power gets seized really overtly, right? But our deep dive today looks at something, well, a lot more insidious, a gradual decline.
It's a really sobering thought, isn't it? And yeah, this deep dive is all about insights from How Democracies Die. It's a really essential book by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, two Harvard political scientists. And they spent, I think, 2 decades really digging into democratic regimes, studying their collapse, their conclusions. They actually describe them as dystopian.
Wow. And here's the part that really gets you. One of their main findings is that democracies might not die at the hands of generals anymore. They die because of elected leaders, presidents, prime ministers, the very people elected to uphold the system, subverting it from the inside. That's a totally different kind of threat.
Exactly. And the authors talk about this democratic recession happening worldwide. It's fueled by things like, well, the massive production of fake news and conspiracy theories. You see it everywhere. It creates this growing feeling that democracy is just, in retreat. And honestly, we saw a very visible effect of this on January 6th with the invasion of the Capitol building.
Right. So if democracies are fading with this kind of whimper, this slow decline, how does that actually, play out? How does this creeping erosion work in practice?
Well, historically, like you said, we pictured democratic breakdowns, and it was often, tanks rolling through the streets, military coups. But since the Cold War ended, that whole pattern has really shifted
Yeah.
dramatically. Now, most of the time, it's not generals causing the breakdown, it's the elected governments themselves.
It's like a slow burn, not a sudden explosion. And a really chilling example they use is Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. He came in as an outsider, right? Tapped into all this public anger against what people saw as a corrupt ruling elite. Got elected back in 1998. And at first he even kept up this, veneer of democracy. He got reelected.
Yeah, but the subversion underneath was just relentless. But gradual, he'd postpone referendums, he rigged the Supreme Court, basically packed it by expanding it massively. He shut down critical media outlets, jailed opponents, even got rid of term limits. And the really stark thing about Venezuela is that it highlights how insidious this is. It took almost 20 years before the world widely recognized it as an autocracy, around
Oh,
2017.
wow, 2 decades. That really drives home the point. It's like that old analogy, right? The frog in the slowly boiling water doesn't realize the danger until it's way too late.
It perfectly captures it. Yeah, it's that slow, almost imperceptible change that's so dangerous.
So, okay, that leads to the big question. How do we spot these figures before they turn up the heat,
Yeah.
before we're all boiling? What specific things, what kind of rhetoric or actions should we really be watching out for, especially if they aren't openly saying, hey, I'm an authoritarian?
That's the absolute crux of it. And Levitsky and Ziblatt, they draw on work by another political scientist, Juan Linz, and they give us this really clear litmus test.
Oh.
4 key warning signs, things you can look for to identify potential authoritarians before they even get into power.
Okay, lay them out for us. What's the first one?
First sign, rejecting the democratic rules of the game, either saying it outright or just through their actions. Undermining elections, suggesting rules don't apply to them.
Okay, and second.
Second is denying the legitimacy of political opponents, baselessly calling them criminals or saying they're subversive, maybe even foreign agents, basically treating opponents not as rivals, but as enemies of the state.
Got it. What's number three?
Third, tolerating or encouraging violence. This can be subtle, like tacitly endorsing supporters who use violence or maybe praising violent acts from the past.
And the last one.
And fourth, showing a willingness to restrict the civil liberties of opponents. That includes the media, threatening lawsuits, proposing new laws to punish critics, using state power against them.
And it's genuinely sobering when you apply that test. You realize how many populist outsiders throughout history and even now seem to tick these boxes. The authors, for example, they look at Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and his presidency through this very lens, and they argue he demonstrably met all 4 criteria.
Right. I mean, just to take their points. Questioning election integrity, saying it would be stolen without evidence. That fits the first sign. Repeatedly calling critical media the enemy of the American people. That's denying legitimacy and threatening civil liberties. They point to things like a doctored video showing him physically attacking a CNN logo as, flirting with or encouraging violence, and then threatening to investigate Hillary Clinton after the election, or talking about broadening libel laws against the media that hits the restriction of liberties point.
And the key thing here, according to the authors, isn't just saying this candidate did these things. It's the comparison. They argue that no other major presidential candidate in modern American history, not even someone like Nixon, who definitely pushed boundaries, showed such a weak public commitment to basic constitutional rights and democratic norms.
Exactly. Nixon, for all his faults, largely paid lip service to the norms in public. The authors see Trump's open disregard as something new and dangerous in the American context. It's a signal that those unwritten rules are breaking down.
So that brings up another really interesting point they make, this idea that historically the real defense against authoritarians wasn't just the Constitution or the people voting, it was the political parties themselves acting as gatekeepers.
Precisely. They argue that in the U.S., for a long time, the parties did a reasonably good job of filtering out extremists. Think about figures like Henry Ford, who's actually praised by Hitler, or Huey Long, Father Coughlin, Joe McCarthy, George Wallace. These were popular figures, some of them, but party leaders basically said, no, you don't represent us, you won't be our nominee.
That's fascinating, but hang on, if the public is really excited about an outsider figure, isn't it kind of undemocratic for the party bosses to just shut them down?
Yeah.
Where's that line between, protecting democracy and just stifling what people want?
That is the core tension, absolutely. And the authors really wrestle with it. Their argument isn't about blocking anyone the public likes. It's about ensuring candidates meet a minimum standard of commitment to the democratic process itself. In the old days, candidate selection often happened behind closed doors in those smoke-filled rooms by party leaders. They had the power to filter. Even when primaries existed, they were often more symbolic. The real power was with the organization men.
Okay, so that system had its own problems, obviously, but it did act as a filter. What broke it down? When did those gates start to crumble?
Well, a big part was the shift after 1972 towards a much stronger primary system. The goal was actually more democracy, giving voters more say. But an unintended consequence was that it opened the door wider for outsiders who didn't have establishment backing.
Then money comes into it, right?
Huge factor, especially the massive increase in outside money in politics, which really took off after the Citizens United Supreme Court decision in 2010. Suddenly, fringe candidates could fund their own campaigns without needing the traditional party donors. They could bypass the party establishment entirely.
Plus, the media landscape changed completely. You have the rise of cable news, like Fox News, what some call the conservative entertainment complex, and then, of course, social media.
Exactly. These platforms made it so much easier for celebrities or figures with extreme views to get name recognition and build a following directly with voters, again, totally circumventing the traditional party structures and gatekeepers.
Which brings us back to the Trump example they use. A celebrity billionaire, no real political history, yet he breezes through the primaries in 2016, even though most Republican leaders didn't back him initially.
Right. That whole idea of the invisible primary, the behind-the-scenes vetting by party elites, donors, insiders, it just collapsed in that cycle. The old gatekeepers found themselves powerless.
And sometimes it's not just that the gates fail, but that the establishment invites the danger in. The book talks about these fateful alliances.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Establishment politicians sometimes try to co-opt a popular demagogue, thinking they can ride their wave or control them. Big mistake, usually. Think of Mussolini in Italy back in 1922. The king invited him to form a government. He saw Mussolini not as a revolutionary threat, but as maybe a useful figure to calm down social unrest.
Or in Venezuela, President Caldera pardoning Hugo Chavez in 1994, letting him out of prison after a coup attempt. Apparently, Caldera thought Chavez was just a passing fad.
Exactly. A huge miscalculation. It gave Chavez legitimacy, turned him into a viable political candidate, and paved the way for his eventual takeover. The lesson is really stark. Established politicians consistently underestimate these figures. They let them in, and then these figures turn around and dismantle the very institutions and parties that enabled them.
So even if you have a strong constitution like the U.S. does, these other factors, the gatekeepers failing, these alliances can seriously weaken things. Which leads to their point about unwritten rules. They argue that even the best constitution has gaps, right? Ambiguities. It can't possibly cover everything.
Absolutely. The Constitution is the framework, but it relies on these informal norms, these unwritten rules, to function smoothly. They act like flexible guardrails for democracy.
And they focus on two main ones. What are they?
The first is mutual tolerance. It sounds simple, but it's profound. It's the idea that you accept your political opponents as legitimate rivals. You see them as decent, patriotic citizens you disagree with, maybe strongly, but not as enemies, not as traitors, not as an existential threat to the country. This, they argue, actually took a long time to develop, even in the U.S.
Okay, mutual tolerance. What's the second key norm?
The second is institutional restraint. This means deliberately not using powers you technically legally possess if doing so violates the spirit of the democratic system or could destabilize it. Think about presidential term limits. Washington set the two-term precedent. It wasn't law for ages, but presidents followed it out of restraint for almost 150 years until FDR, or court packing. Changing the Supreme Court's size is technically legal, Congress can do it, but by the late 19th century, it became seen as unacceptable, a violation of restraint. When FDR tried it in 1937, even his own party pushed back hard.
Right, like using the filibuster in the Senate. It used to be a rare last resort tool, but now.
Exactly. Its frequent use today is a classic sign of declining institutional restraint.
And the authors argue these guardrails have been seriously eroding in the U.S., especially since the 1980s. They talk about constitutional hardball. What do they mean by that?
Constitutional hardball is basically playing politics as if it's war, but using legal means. It's pushing every rule, every procedure to its absolute limit, not just to win a policy debate, but to permanently cripple your opponents. Examples they give from other countries include things like impeaching judges you don't like, or presidents ruling by decree when they can't get laws passed. And they point to U.S. history, too. After Reconstruction, southern states used things like poll taxes and literacy tests. These were legally crafted to seem neutral, but everyone knew their real purpose was to disenfranchise black voters and lock in white Democratic control. That was constitutional hardball.
And they really highlight Newt Gingrich's impact in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, they argue Gingrich fundamentally changed the tone of American politics. He encouraged Republicans to start seeing Democrats as opponents and start seeing them as, like, evil, immoral, using words like sick, traitor. This breakdown in mutual tolerance paved the way for more aggressive tactics, like the sharp increase in using the filibuster and eventually the impeachment of President Clinton, which notably lacked broad bipartisan support, unlike, say, the Nixon process.
And it just kept escalating from there, didn't it?
It did. Through the Bush years, the Obama years. More partisan warfare, Democrats using the filibuster more against Bush judges, Republicans then engaging in unprecedented obstructionism against Obama. Mitch McConnell openly saying his main goal was making Obama a one-term president. That's not normal legislative opposition. That's arguably a rejection of the president's legitimacy. Obama, in turn, used executive orders more forcefully, sometimes bypassing Congress, which also strained norms.
And then came the Merrick Garland situation in 2016. The Senate refusing to even hold hearings for Obama's Supreme Court nominee.
That, the authors argue, was a truly radical blow. Unprecedented. It signaled that institutional restraint, at least on that issue, was basically gone for one side.
So where does all this animosity, this polarization come from? It's not just about politicians behaving badly, is it?
No, it runs much deeper. The authors point to fundamental societal divisions, race, religion, geography, even culture or way of life. They cite data showing how much disapproval of marrying someone from the other party has skyrocketed. It used to be tiny, like 4 or 5% in the 60s. By 2010, it was up to a third or even half the population finding it unacceptable.
Wow. And race is a huge factor in the U.S. context.
Absolutely. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act in the 60s, while morally necessary and democratizing the South, had the political effect of polarizing the parties along racial lines. White Southerners largely moved to the Republican Party, while minority voters overwhelmingly aligned with the Democrats. You also had a religious shift, with the GOP becoming the party strongly identified with white evangelical Christians, and Democrats becoming more secular.
And they mentioned something called status anxiety.
Yeah, drawing on the historian Richard Hofstadter. It's this feeling among some groups, particularly, they argue, white Christian Americans, that the country they recognize, the one where they felt dominant, is slipping through their fingers. This anxiety, this sense of loss, fuels resentment and makes slogans like, "Take our country back," or "Make America great again," really potent.
So putting it all together,
Mm-hmm.
the weak gatekeepers, the broken guardrails, the authors basically conclude that by the time Donald Trump was elected, the system was already in a pretty fragile state.
Exactly. The guardrails were, in their words, weaker than they had been in a century.
Okay, so when an elected leader with authoritarian tendencies does get into power in this weakened system, what's the playbook? How do they actually go about subverting democracy from within?
They usually start by trying to capture the neutral arbitrators of the system. That means the courts, Law enforcement agencies like the FBI, intelligence agencies like the CIA. The tactics include purging officials who show independence and packing institutions with loyalists. We saw this in Hungary under Viktor Orban. Chavez did it in Venezuela, expanding the Supreme Court massively. Sometimes it's even cruder, like using blackmail. They mentioned Vladimiro Montesinos in Peru, who secretly recorded politicians and judges to control them.
And the book points to Trump's actions here, too.
Yes, they interpret his demands for personal loyalty from FBI directors, his pressure on Comey over investigations, his public attacks on his own Attorney General Jeff Sessions, pardoning allies like Joe Arpaio, and his threats to revoke media licenses. They see all these as attempts to capture or neutralize those key arbitrators.
Okay, so capture the refs. What's next?
Then you go after the other key players who might resist. The opposition leaders, critical media outlets, maybe even independent business leaders. One way is to try and buy them off, offer government jobs, contracts, favors, sometimes outright bribes. Fujimori did this effectively in Peru. Or you attack them using the state's power. Think libel lawsuits. Rafael Correa in Ecuador won a huge judgment against a newspaper. Using tax authorities to investigate critics, Putin did this against media and oligarchs like Khodorkovsky in Russia. Erdogan did it in Turkey.
And again, Trump's rhetoric about the media being the enemy of the American people, tweeting violent imagery against CNN, that fits this pattern.
According to the authors, yes, it aims to delegitimize and intimidate potential sources of opposition.
So capture the refs, sideline the key players. Then what?
Then you start rewriting the rules of the game to lock in your advantage. This is crucial. Manipulating the electoral system is common. Gerrymandering, redrawing district boundaries to heavily favor your party happens in many places, like Malaysia or Hungary, and certainly in the U.S.
And voter suppression, sadly, has a long history.
A very long and ugly history. We mentioned the poll taxes and literacy test after Reconstruction. More recently, the authors point to things like strict voter ID laws or purges of voter rolls in the U.S. While often justified publicly by claims of preventing voter fraud claims for which there's very little evidence, these measures tend to disproportionately affect low-income voters, students, and minorities, groups that often lean Democratic. They see Trump's controversial Election Integrity Commission, for example, as an attempt to encourage more voter roll purges and restrictions, echoing those older tactics.
And the final piece of the playbook seems to be exploiting crises.
Absolutely. This is a classic move. A war, a terrorist attack, a major economic downturn, even a natural disaster. These moments of fear and uncertainty are golden opportunities for would-be authoritarians. They can use the crisis to claim extraordinary powers, silence critics in the name of national unity or security, and push through undemocratic measures that wouldn't fly in normal times. Think of Ferdinand Marcos declaring martial law in the Philippines after some mysterious bombings in 1972, or Hitler consolidating power after the Reichstag fire in 1933, or Erdogan cracking down massively after the failed coup attempt in 2016.
So crises become these windows of opportunity to break democratic constraints quickly and sometimes even legally using emergency powers.
Precisely. It's a really dangerous dynamic.
Okay, wow. That is a pretty bleak picture of how things can unravel. So given all that, is there hope? Can democracy actually be rescued once it starts down this path? What do Levitsky and Ziblatt suggest?
They definitely don't just leave us with the doom and gloom. They offer strategies, drawing lessons from history where democracy was defended. A key one comes from those successful gatekeepers we talked about earlier. When an authoritarian threat emerges, mainstream political parties must be willing to distance themselves, even denounce figures from their own side. And crucially, they need to forge a united front to defeat the threat, even if that means making alliances with parties they normally disagree with intensely.
Can you give some examples of where that actually worked?
Yeah, they cite Belgium in the 1930s, where the main Catholic party allied with socialists and liberals to block the fascist Rex party, even kicking extremists out of their own ranks. Or Finland, also in the 30s, where conservatives teamed up with social democrats against a far-right movement called Lapua, a more recent example. Austria in 2016. The main center-right party actually endorsed the Green Party candidate for president, specifically to stop the candidate from the far-right Freedom Party from winning. That takes serious political courage, putting democracy above partisanship.
That's remarkable. And it also implies that how the opposition behaves is really critical.
Hugely important. They warn against falling into what they call the Venezuelan trap. Opponents of Chavez tried everything, a military coup attempt, paralyzing general strikes, boycotting elections. But all these tactics failed. Worse, they backfired. They allowed Chavez to paint the opposition as undemocratic rebels, giving him the perfect excuse to purge institutions and crack down even harder.
So what's the alternative?
They contrast Venezuela with Colombia under President Alvaro Uribe, who also showed some authoritarian tendencies. There, the opposition largely focused its efforts on working through existing institutions, Congress, and the courts. By doing that, it was much harder for Uribe to dismiss them as illegitimate or anti-democratic. And ultimately, it was the Constitutional Court that blocked Uribe's attempt to run for a third term, a major victory for democratic constraints. The principle is, if institutional channels for resistance still exist, use them. Don't adopt the other side's norm-breaking tactics just because they seem to be working for them. That's a race to the bottom.
That makes sense. What about the role of the public, of citizens? Is there something beyond just voting?
Yes, they emphasize the vital importance of civic education, especially, they note, in emerging nations like Brazil that have histories of instability or violence. In places like that, democracy can sometimes be seen as just a bureaucratic procedure, lacking deeper abstract value. People might not understand why these norms and institutions matter. As they put it, democracy cannot be perpetuated without civic education.
And they mentioned a specific program in Brazil.
Yeah, Brazil's Future Voter Program. Run by electoral courts, it actively engages kids and teenagers, teaching them about ethics, politics, citizenship, the separation of powers, even how to fight disinformation. They use things like debates and mock voting simulations to try and build an active democratic identity from a young age. The goal is fostering a real understanding and appreciation for democracy to prevent what the philosopher Etienne de la Boétie called voluntary servitude, people passively accepting authoritarian rule.
That's powerful. What about fixing the political parties themselves, the ones that failed as gatekeepers?
That's crucial too. For the U.S. context, they suggest the Republican Party, for example, needs to somehow rebuild its establishment. That means regaining some control over finances, grassroots organizing, media influence, and candidate selection. Essentially, finding ways to become less dependent on outside billionaire donors and the dictates of right-wing media personalities, allowing more traditional party values to reassert themselves.
Is there historical precedent for a party reinventing itself like that after flirting with extremism?
Yes, and they point to post-World War II Germany. The Christian Democratic Union, CDU, was formed from the ashes of a totally discredited German right wing. They succeeded by making a very clear break from the Nazi past, purging extremists, and deliberately building a broader, more moderate coalition, uniting Catholics and Protestants, for instance. It shows that parties can change course. They also argue parties need to find ways to win elections that don't rely so heavily on mobilizing a dwindling white Christian base or making appeals, coded or otherwise, to white nationalism. They need to broaden their appeal.
And finally, there's the economic dimension to all this polarization and instability.
Yes, this is a really important underlying factor they stress. That intense partisan hatred isn't just about cultural or racial differences. It's also deeply connected to slowing economic growth, stagnant wages, and growing economic inequality. That economic insecurity and resentment creates fertile ground for polarization and demagoguery.
So what's the implication for policy?
They suggest that addressing economic inequality head-on could actually help lower the political temperature. Policies like universal health care, significantly higher minimum wages, or robust family support programs like paid leave or subsidized childcare. These kinds of universalist policies, common in some Northern European countries, tend to benefit a wide range of people, including both minority groups and the white working class. By reducing economic stress and resentment across the board, these policies might help build broader coalitions and make people less susceptible to the politics of division and anger that authoritarians thrive on.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today. We've seen how democracies can indeed die slowly, subtly, not just in violent upheavals. We've looked at those 4 key warning signs for spotting potential authoritarians, understood why political parties acting as gatekeepers are so critical, and why those unwritten rules, the guardrails of mutual tolerance and institutional restraint, are absolutely essential.
Yeah, and we've also walked through the typical playbook that elected autocrats use to consolidate power, capturing the referees, sidelining opponents, rewriting the rules, exploiting crises. But importantly, we also touched on strategies for pushing back, forging broad pro-democracy alliances, using existing institutions wisely, investing in civic education, reforming parties, and tackling that underlying economic inequality.
And the sobering reality is that the United States, even with its long democratic tradition and strong constitution, isn't immune. It's vulnerable to the very same patterns that have damaged or destroyed democracies elsewhere. The book uses the example of recent political battles in North Carolina, things like stripping the governor's powers, as a stark illustration of what politics without guardrails looks like right here at home.
It really is a cautionary tale.
And it leads to their final, powerful conclusion. No single political leader can end democracy. No single leader can rescue a democracy either. Democracy is a shared enterprise. Its fate depends on all of us. So as you listening reflect on this deep dive, maybe think about that. What actions, big or small, can you take? Maybe it's strengthening mutual tolerance in your own conversations, or advocating for institutional restraint when you see it violated, or finding ways to support civic education in your community. Because the future of democracy here and around the world really does seem to depend on that collective vigilance, that shared commitment from all of us.